Hello there, and welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. So, if you followed my bonus video where I explained why I'd taken a week off, you'd also know that as of last week, from when I've recorded this video, I got married. Now, the original plan or consideration that I was before I decided to take the week off was that potentially I was going to theme the week of my honeymoon around wedding films and do a daily upload of pre-recorded potentially, or even done during the honeymoon films. Now, as it all played out, I decided against that idea and decided to enjoy a week off and enjoy my honeymoon. And so I thought it would be nice to sort of take a little bit of time and maybe do an actual wedding film. I might do a loose theme this month of just, inserting a couple of wedding-centric films. I might not. We'll see. I'm going to be a little bit flexible about that. But it was strongly encouraged by producer wife Helen that I at least cover one, and the one she wanted me to address is the 1999 Gary Marshall romantic comedy Runaway Bride. It's funny, really, because I remember Runaway Bride. Now, bearing in mind, when it came out, I could only have been 7. But I remember there was a big media sort of storm about the fact that, Runaway Bride, it brings together a reunion of Gary Marshall, Richard Gere, and Julia Roberts, and since 1990s Pretty Woman. And then I also, and I cannot believe I remember this, but I also remember it horribly flopping. I mean, it did well, because it's a romantic comedy and it had those names attached. But critically, I distinctly remember the fact that it was a film that just got absolutely held over the coals. Now, talking to Helen about it, she has a very different memory of this, in that it's a well-received film. Yes, it's a Gary Marshall romantic comedy, sort of as he was not quite winding up his era, which I think is distinctly in the 90s, but he was coming to the end of sort of his big popular run, and that this was a pretty good film and a pretty good wedding film. And again, it really shows the chemistry between Julia Roberts and Richard Gere. And so I was willing to go in open-minded with it. There was still that weird hostility I had. I still was going in thinking, and possibly it's not a healthy way to go into a film with the sort of expectations of, I've heard this isn't bad. It's not a way to approach a film, ever. But strangely, I did on this occasion. And I was quite taken aback by how naturally this film just flowed for me. It really did it hit all the beats of things that I've addressed in other romantic comedies of this style and era. And I've started to see the pattern of romantic comedies, sort of New York-ish set romantic comedies, it sort of goes from the late 80s through to the early noughties. And the pattern really comes from the fact that a lot of these films are either based around or conceived from the almost columnist or article-based approach to romance and sort of romantic ideas that we have. So, of course, going back to when Harry met Sally, and I mean, it was one of those ones where when Harry Met Sally doesn't have any, there aren't any writer characters or journalist characters in it, and it's only thematically posed, but the whole thing of can a man and a woman ever be friends? But it's structured and written in a way, and of course with the talking heads, has that sense of almost like it's an article, like it's a journalist piece about posing that question and looking at different relationships. And of course, films I've covered here have that same journalist style to them, columnist style, where it's sort of broadly discussing a thesis or a theme. I mean, Woody Allen's career seems to have been, or at least in this period, seems to have broadly be based on that idea. And again, this does the same thing, where it's, it has Richard Gere, who is a columnist, who writes a very bad article about a small town girl who famously has run out on 3 of her weddings, with her 4th wedding pending. And of course it becomes about him writing this bad article, being called out for the mistakes he makes, the hyperbole, the misogyny, the factual errors, the misrepresentation of character, the fact that he essentially just threw this article out without any consideration or research. And the rest of the film becomes about him going to this small town, learning about Julia Roberts' character, learning about the community, and why, posing a question, why would a woman run out on 3 weddings consecutively? And once it becomes about that, I actually really like this film. I think I like the almost article-based thesis of romantic comedies. I like the idea that it goes, we're going to address a certain thing, that of course, as I've mentioned over the last couple of months, we are in this strange last couple of decades, all about deconstruction and deconstruction of genre. And what I kind of like about this era is the fact that it's not about deconstructing the romantic comedy or romantic genre. It's more a deconstruction of our ideas of romance societally, especially Western, American sort of ideas of romance and marriage, and what people's, sort of the trappings we've fallen into. And so, it really does pose an interesting sort of challenge. If a woman runs, or rides a horse, or jumps on the moped out of 3 weddings, what does that say about her? What does it say about the community she's come from? What does it say about the people she was about to marry? And it does smartly address all of these things. It goes, it actually tries to examine, and deconstruct that sense of, that story, that sense of like, what psychologically is going on with this woman? What, is there something wrong with her? Is she some kind of man-eater, as was falsely written in the original article by Richard Gere's character, or is there more going on? And smartly, of course, it then, establishes there's more going on. And I think it doesn't even veer away from some of the darker topics. I mean, they're not dark in like a big sense, but they're, just small issues that people have, like her father's alcoholism, or the fact that, she is, or like the almost not underhand, but subliminal misogyny that's going on between her current fiance, the men that she does associate with in this small town, and her own father, and even the internalized misogyny of the women in her life and the way that they treat her. And it looks at, like I said, the alcoholism of her father, the fact that her mother died at a sort of pivotal time in her life, and the fact that she psychologically has been very badly affected by these events, by her relationships with people, and it doesn't sort of, as I say, the initial article poses the thing of, she's a man-eater, she uses men until, she runs out on them. And it, like I say, though it throws that out very quickly, it does address the idea that perhaps she has a toxic relationship with men, and an unhealthy relationship with every man around her. So that includes characters like her friends' husbands, or men that she was previously involved with, or even like men she's never been involved with but has almost a light flirtation with, and whether there is something problematic about the way that, she sort of nurtured this sort of, or fostered this environment around herself, and how unhealthy that is. And I think that's a really mature way to examine a character like that. And I do think up to a point it really does really do a good job. And again, the Richard Gere character, though yes, he's active in this narrative, and he does do, his whole thing is part vengeance because he is doing things to undermine her current nuptials, to undermine her in the eyes of her community. He can't help but fall back into his journalist ways, and he actually is trying to learn and examine. And it is a story about how a slightly disillusioned New York journalist who sort of throws out these misogynistic articles actually goes to the effort of learning about a woman and learning about, the community that has constrained her and how it's affected her. And I think that shows that both characters are really well done. And then, okay, so those things are excellent. I think in that respect it's a really strong piece. Unfortunately, there are some really... On some level, there's a sense where, and I wonder whether this is a case of a incredible script was put into production, and because of the time, because of perhaps the hands of certain producers who wanted to do something with it, or maybe Gary Marshall wanted to had certain visions of it, it does feel a bit like a Frankenstein case, where you have a really strong core premise and idea and examination and good character work, and then it loses itself in certain respects. I mean, for instance, the Julia Roberts Richard Gere thing is yes, they have good chemistry in this. Yes, it was great to see them back together. And it generated the big, the great attention of bringing these two actors who do work so well together, into sort of big spotlight. But it does make me question things like, I do wonder whether this piece is far too much about them as a romantic couple, when I don't really think it's a particularly good romance in that respect. I do think there is romantic elements, and that you lose something if there is no romantic feeling between them. But I think the idea that this leads towards a more traditional romantic comedy relationship, I think weakens it. I think it's better when it's more internalized and it's more about self-examination. I also wonder, on another level, whether Julia Roberts is entirely right for this. I think she is charismatic and sweet and does have a good arc, and she does really well in it. But there's something about her that doesn't... I feel like there's a character that's written, and then her performance, and to me there was just something a little bit out of sync. And I don't know if it's because this is supposed to be like a small town girl, and I don't know if sort of the cultural impact of seeing Julia Roberts there is just makes her stand out in a way that, if you put her alongside a lot of the other characters from this, she just slightly is out of sync with the character she's playing for me. Now that might be a personal thing, I don't know, but it doesn't quite work because she's playing it. And I do wonder about something else, whether this is really supposed to be more a centrepiece around her, with Richard Gere's character being more sort of he's not a side character, but like a second character to her, whereas the way it's portrayed is a two-hander between them. And I do think it would have been a stronger piece if his character's still a main, still leading, but his character's just that little bit behind hers, and it's more an examination of her character, with him learning about himself through examining her, rather than it trying to, again, push the Richard Gere, Julia Roberts dynamic. And it all comes down to, ultimately, the great failing of the film, which is the third act, where I genuinely think it was a mature, as I said, reflective examination of communities, the way they treat women, the way women box themselves and yet are being psychologically affected. And it actually, it's still a comedy. It's still got funny characters and asides and good chemistry and all the things to make a good romantic comedy. But it was more of a character study with funny local colour. In the third act, it decides to really veer more into a traditional romantic comedy, and that's where it loses me, because it all of a sudden the jokes are a bit broader, the way the setup works, and I won't spoil it, but it just falls so flat on its face for me that I the goodwill from the first two acts are almost completely lost. I do still think this is a really good film, but that third act was so bad, was so not what I wanted, and so out of pace, and didn't make sense in terms of the characters and the way the story was being told. It almost felt like half an hour of a film between the second and third act were missing to almost justify how they got from one place to the next place. And I honestly, I could, that was the thing that lost me. And I really feels like, not that it's from a different film, but as I say, it feels like a section of the film that explains how one thing gets to the next thing really is missing, or something there just doesn't really make as much sense as I think the film wanted it to. And it, in terms of the internal logic and the way that it wants to examine certain ideas, the third act is trying to say something and do something and create a sense of arc. But it is a case of a film that was treating things with much more delicacy, much more sort of being very subtle, just losing all subtlety, losing all delicacy, and just going, let's just make this big final set piece that then leads to a fairly long epilogue as well, that frankly I just think the whole pace of the film from the end of the second act on is just lost. It's just the pacing's all over the place. And it's a shame. Like I say, it's a bit of a Frankenstein in that respect, and it that's what loses me. And it's interesting. I would like to go back and watch Pretty Woman now and see what because again, it'd be interesting to see Gary Marshall almost in reverse and go back to his earlier stuff. I mean, unfortunately, with the exception of Princess Diaries, this is sort of him. I mean, I haven't seen Raising Helen, but it is sort of the point in which his style possibly was coming out of favour, and it possibly was starting to date. And again, he was becoming an older director. Towards the end of his life, he was coming towards the end of his life. I mean, he still worked for another 16 years, but this is definitely sort of the end of his peak, as it were. This is the end of his peak era where, romantic. If you saw Gary Marshall romantic comedy, it would be like seeing a Judd Apatow comedy a decade later. But yeah, interesting. It was an interesting sort of examination in that respect. But yeah, I am glad I saw it because I can finally say what I like and what I don't about it, and I think the criticisms are flawed and incorrect to a certain degree, and then unfortunately they then come back down around to being right. But yeah, it's interesting. If nothing else, like I say, it's an interesting study in great script work that feels like it gets messed with. Anyway, thank you for joining me. If you like this video, hit the like button, comment below, and share the video, because it'll help me in the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel, and hit that little bell to get notifications of when new videos are uploaded. Check out my back catalogue of over 150 videos, and follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I'm always tweeting about TV series and films, and I share these videos once they're uploaded to YouTube either the day of or the day after. Thank you for joining me. Take care.